Hey girl, it's Audra. Thanks for joining me on another episode of She Travels Light. This is the place where we focus on ditching our emotional baggage, getting out of our own way, and embracing God's plan for our lives. So this week, we are actually going to be talking about a subject that I've kind of been mentioning the past few weeks, and I feel like now is just a really good time to really address it. So it's something that I feel like the church doesn't just they don't talk about it enough, especially when it comes to singles. And it's really a shame because it just means that everyone else's thoughts and opinions about it are becoming accepted as truth because we're not hearing enough truth from the church on this subject. So the subject in question that we're actually going to be talking about today is sex. So make sure you stick around, and I have a feeling this episode's probably going to run a little long. So thanks for sticking with me. Also, if you're at work or something, maybe want to put some headphones on. Your boss may look at you a little funny if he or she knows you're listening to a podcast about sex today. But what we're actually going to cover is God's original design for sex. We're going to talk about the stuff I just wish somebody would have told me about sex when I was single. And we're really going to take a look at what sexual integrity actually looks like for a woman in the 21st century. So why this topic? Well, for me, talking about God's plan for sex is just kind of a passion of mine because there's so much that I didn't know when I was in high school and in college. And I really wish that everything I would have learned later in life would have been just basic knowledge that everybody would have learned in middle school and high school, because it just would have saved me a lot of drama, a lot of heartache, and just a lot of problems that I even brought into my marriage because I just didn't know any better. So for me, if I can, stop somebody from making the same mistakes I did, or I can show them how to get healing in this area, it's totally worth it. Because again, I just feel like it's such a topic that is just not talked about in Christian circles, which is just ridiculous because God designed sex. He created it. He made it. He knows everything about it. So I feel like as Christians, we should all be authorities on sex because it's something that God made for people. So I just feel very strongly about it. And I hope that you guys get a lot out of today's episode. So for me, the way I actually found out what sex was because I used to listen to talk radio and I would leave it on all night. And one night they were talking about sex and explaining how it worked. And I don't remember how old I was. I was probably 12 or 13. And I was like, oh, that's what it is. That's weird. I don't know how I feel about that because it's not something that my parents ever discussed with me. The only thing, the only sex education I got growing up was God said, don't have sex till you're married. And that was it. That was that. It's not something we talked about in our youth group. It just wasn't it wasn't a topic of conversation, except of course, among all of my friends. So I feel like the worst place for a 15-year-old to get advice about sex is from another 15-year-old who's out there having sex. That's just a bad plan. But when we don't talk about it and we don't make it a topic that is, familiar and easy to talk about, especially among young people, then we just go out and we get dumb advice from people who also don't know anything. And it just causes a big mess. And that's pretty much how things worked out for me in high school and in college. And I waited until I was 21 to have actual physical intercourse, sex, because I thought that that's what counted, was having actual intercourse. But even then, there was just so much damage that had already been done up to that point. And I thought, well, I'm doing good because I'm 21 and I finally decided to lose my virginity because I thought that I was in love with somebody and it totally didn't work out. And so I figured, well, what's the point in hanging on to my virginity now? I thought that guy and I were really going to make it and become a couple and get married, and it didn't work out. So what's the point of waiting? So I really went through a process for about a year where I just was I don't care. I'll do whatever I want to do because what's the point of waiting for sex? And it was during that year of just kind of exploring that I really came to the realization that casual sex is not for me. That's not the kind of person I am. That is not how my mind works. It just wasn't for me. It took honestly about a year for me to come to that conclusion. And that's when I made the decision right before I met my husband that I just was going to wait until I got married, because I kind of learned the hard way about sex. And I would hate for other people, which I'm sure a lot of you listening probably already have. If not, if you haven't had sex, and I would hope that you'll get some information out of this that will help you avoid learning things the hard way like I did. One of the things that I think people really take for granted is that desire and sex are like fire. It's their nature. Like, that's the way that God created them. And he created them that way for a purpose, because desire and sex together, like when you mix it, that's what brings forth life. That's what produces the next generation and allows us to fill the physical portion of his mandate to go forth and multiply. So it's an incredibly powerful force. But people don't treat it that way. They don't treat it as a powerful and sacred act that brings forth life and is us honoring God in a way with our bodies. They don't think of it that way, and they don't treat it that way. And because they don't, it ends up getting twisted, and it becomes something that can be very damaging. So if you think about it this way, if you're a parent and you have a child who wants to stick their hand in a fire, as a parent, you're going to tell them not to do that because you don't want them to get burned. And if they go ahead and they stick their hand in that fire and they get burned, them being burned is not a punishment from you. That is just simply cause and effect. They stuck their hand in the fire, it got burned. The fire didn't burn them because you were mad and it was punishing them. That's just the nature of fire, right? So desire and the sex are the same for us. They burn the ever-living daylights out of us when we use them incorrectly. So if you think about it, like a fire can provide light and warmth and all sorts of wonderful things for a child, but they have to use fire and respect it and be able to use it within the boundaries that it's given so that it's safe for them to use it. So that's why when God gave us sex, he put it within the boundary of marriage so that we would be able to handle it safely. And it's us using it outside of the boundary of marriage that causes us to get burned. So, the allure of desire and sex is like, it's so strong. And that's because it's meant to serve a specific function in the kingdom. So just as a fire has heat that's also meant to complete a specific function, we have to make sure that we're using it, again, in the guidelines and boundaries that God set for our own safety. Otherwise, we end up with kind of the consequences and the burn of, sexual desires. We know it's STDs, it's unplanned pregnancies, it's heartache, when relationships go wrong, when we have sexual relationships that go wrong. It's uncontrolled lust, it's pornography, it's sex trafficking, it's all of that. All of that is a result of us not respecting the fire that God has given us in sex and trying to use it any which way we want to instead of the way that he created it for. Because fire causes damage, it causes burns. And so this is something too that's kind of crazy when you actually think about it. When people get burned, they may not, realize the extent of the damage, especially if they've been burned multiple times. But if you are continuously burning yourself over and over, eventually it's going to kill all the nerve endings in whatever part of the body is continuously burned. So then you don't really feel any further damage. Now, this kind of happened to my husband because he's worked in kitchens for a long time. He has what we call oven mitts. Like, he's burned himself so many times checking the temperature of foods and touching hot things that he can touch stuff that is crazy hot because of the way, like the damage he's just done to his hand after years and years of working in commercial kitchens. So that doesn't mean that when fire touches him or he touches something hot, that it's not damaging him. It just means that his, the nerves are so deadened, the skin is so rough, it's so calloused that you can't perceive the actual damage that's happening. And the same thing happens to our hearts. The same thing happens to our heart attitudes when we start to believe that sex is only physical and that there is no spiritual or emotional connection involved in it. And we aren't able to feel it because we've built up these calluses and we've built up this damage in our hearts to where we can't even perceive the other parts of what's actually happening when we have sex. Because it doesn't mean that there aren't other things going on. It just means that we can't perceive them, just like a person who is colorblind. Doesn't mean that there's no colors, it just means that you can't see them. Or if your taste buds are gone, again, doesn't mean that things don't have a taste, it just means that you can't taste it. And it's that state of not being able to perceive those things and having a calloused heart that I really want to help prevent for a lot of you guys. Well, heck, for all of you guys. I want no one to have a calloused heart. I want no one to just end up seeing sex as something physical that doesn't really matter. I really want to be able to help you guys see it for what it really is. So what is God's plan for sex? Well, sex is something that God designed to be in the bounds of marriage between one man and one woman. And why one man and one woman and not two women or two men? Because when God created people, he gave part of his attributes to men, and then he gave other parts of his attributes to women, so that together as men and women, especially in a marriage, we would reflect the fullness of who God is. Because when we look at the Trinity of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, they're a family. God the Father, the Spirit is more of the feminine form, not female, because God is not male or female, but the Spirit is more of the feminine form of God. And of course, Jesus Christ is the Son. They're a family together in relationship. That is how a marriage is set up. It's to reflect the Trinity. It's husband and wife and child. And you can't get that with two men or two women. That's why when God created marriage, it's for men and women in that order, for that reason. Because marriage and sex is not about us. It's not about our pleasure or our enjoyment or because we fell in love. Marriage and sex and family and children is all about us glorifying God and reflecting his nature and his glory and reflecting back who he is inside of us. That's what it's about. And because God is good, he's made sex to be something that's wonderful and feels great and is super enjoyable. And it's something that he wants us as husbands and wives to have a lot of. If you look at Corinthians, it's 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Where Paul is talking about that the wife gives authority over her body to the husband, and the husband gives authority over his body to the wife. And he says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterwards, you should come together again so Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. God wants husbands and wives to have amazing, mind-blowing, awesome sex all the time. And I think that's one of the ways that sometimes in the church, when we talk about sex, it's for marriage, it's almost like you want to try to make it sound like it's dirty, like, oh, don't have sex, don't do that, it's bad, it's awful, it's this and that, but that's not the truth. The truth is, in the right context, it's not bad, it's not dirty, it's not awful, it's not anything. It is God honoring and affirming and wonderful and beautiful. And I think that we have to get that clear picture of it, that sex it's awesome. It's a gift from God to us, because really, he could have made us have babies anyway. Like we could be laying eggs like, ducks or something. We could have procreated anyway. God designed it, in the way he did, and he made it feel good and he made it feel wonderful because it's a gift to us. Because one of the main things that we get from sex, of course, is children. It's that procreation. And I think that is one of the ways that God just reveals himself to us. We get to understand his heart even more when we do have kids, because God is a father. And when we come together as husband and wife and we have that kind of close relationship and we learn how to give ourselves for our spouse, and then a baby comes along, you understand God in a completely different realm once you have a child and you start having to give yourself for this child and protect them and take care of them and love them. And you know that no matter what your child does, you're always going to have their back and take care of them. You understand God in this completely different way when you get a picture of his heart as a father because you're a parent. So that's what I mean about sex just being this wonderful and creative and beautiful force that's a gift, because once it comes to fruition and you have a child, it even more allows you to understand God and his heart and who he is. But like I said, It doesn't always work out that way. It doesn't always work out that people wait until they get married and then they, end up having sex and having a baby and going, with God's plan. Because we live in a fallen world. It is what it is. Our culture at this point is so oversaturated by sex. And even in Christian cultures where I forget the exact statistics and I apologize. I'm normally really good about looking them up, but I think, don't quote me, I think there's something like 50% of Christian couples are living together and having sex because they just don't feel like celibacy is relevant anymore. Because nowadays, when you're dating somebody, sex is kind of a given, like that's part of a relationship. Most people will look at you kind of strange if you're dating somebody for 6 months or even 2 months or whatever, and you're not having sex. It's kind of like, that's weird. Even when Steve Harvey wrote that book, Think Like a Man, Act Like a Lady or whatever. And his novel idea was to make a man wait, 90 days to have sex. The women were like, oh, that's a great idea. And I'm over here like, 90 days? 90, that's it? That's it? Just 90? Okay, that's okay, whatever. But even then, people just feel like sex is part and the parcel of being in a relationship. If you're dating, especially if you're living together, you're having sex. And that is not at all the way that God designed it. So one of the ways I think that we get ourselves tripped up, and this is the first thing that I wish I would have known about sex when I was in high school, is that all sex is sex. And I know that sounds self-explanatory, but let me tell you what I mean. I was of the opinion that only like actual intercourse was sex. Well, that meant if I was having oral sex or if I was engaging, in super heavy petting with somebody, or if I was doing anything other than actually having like vaginal intercourse, that I wasn't having sex. But that's not the case, because all sex is sex. It doesn't matter how you try to break it down. All sex is sex. It all counts. And I love this definition from a book called Hooked. And it says that sex is any intentionally sexual, intimate behavior between two individuals that involves arousal, stimulation, and or response by at least one of the two parties, or even one person if self-stimulation is used. So sexual activity is going to run the gamut from kissing to heavy petting to, fantasizing to oral sex to self-stimulation. Like all of that counts as sex. And I bring this up because I don't want you guys lying to yourselves and deceiving yourselves the way that I did myself. Because I said, oh, I didn't have sex until I was 21. Well, that wasn't true. I had been having all kinds of other sex. I just wasn't counting it because in my mind, I thought as long as we weren't doing the quote unquote deed, I wasn't having sex and I was living the life of a virgin and was sexually moral. But that's not the case. So I don't want you to deceive yourself. All sex is sex, point blank. Another thing that I wish I would have known is that you are going to be sexually compatible with far more people than you are relationally compatible with. Meaning the chances of you having good sex with somebody that you meet is a lot higher than the chances of you being relationally compatible with them, meaning that you would be able to have a meaningful long-term relationship or even a marriage with that person. And I think that that's where people get tripped up a lot. They think that because they're having good sex with somebody, or if they're in a relationship and they're having sex and the sex is really good, they feel like they're really in love and the relationship has, the capacity to become something more and to become a marriage. And some people do get, they get married based on their sexual compatibility, but that's not an actual gauge of how relationally compatible you're going to be, because again, you will probably have great sex with far more people, or the ability to have great sex with far more people than you have actual partners that would be good marriage partners. And I wish that I would have known that, because that's how you get tripped up. That's how you end up staying in these relationships that aren't good, or that they're probably not going to go anywhere, but you keep hoping and you keep wishing and you keep sticking it out because you feel like, oh, well, the sex is good and we like a lot of the same things and this, that, and the other. And you're not actually measuring that relationship and that standard in a way that's actually helpful for you to figure out if marriage or long-term is going to be something smart for you. And a lot of that has to do with the sex that you have. And that's why it's so important to understand that point. Another thing that I wish I would have known And I'm actually gonna spend the majority of my time on this section because this is so important. This is the part that if I'd have known this when I was in high school and college, it would have completely changed the trajectory of every relationship that I had. This was the missing piece. This was the key for me to understanding everything about sex. And this is what I wish that churches would talk about more. This is what I wish parents would learn and understand and tell their children. This is what I wish Christian women would understand so that they can encourage their sisters in Christ with why it's so important to keep sex out of a relationship when you're not married. So sex is not just physical. And I kind of touched on that earlier in this episode. Like, we all know the physical outcomes of sex. We know that there's STDs that could happen. We know there's unplanned pregnancies. We know there's very lovely planned pregnancies and babies that you want to have and all this. We know that sex can like lower blood pressure. It can increase your immune system. It can strengthen bladder control. It feels great, all that stuff. Like, we're pretty much experts on the physical side of sex because that's all anybody ever talks about. So we all pretty much know how it goes. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time harping on STDs or anything like that because most people already know that. What we don't know, what we don't understand, and what does not get spoken about is the fact that we are not just physical beings, right? We're mind, body, and spirit. And so when we have sex, it affects our minds, our bodies, and our spirits. And those two pieces, the spirit and the body, is what we're going to be digging into in this part here. So your mind. How do our brains process sex? Like, what happens in our brains when we have sex? One of the things that happens is that there's a lot of chemicals that are released. And we're going to touch on two of the biggest ones. There's more than this, but two of the biggest ones are what we're going to focus on. And the first one is dopamine. That is a feel-good chemical. So it gives us like energy and exhilaration and focus when we do something that we really like and something that we enjoy. So it's what keeps us kind of wanting to go back to things that we find pleasurable. So it's like our brain's reward chemical. It gives us a natural high when we like have a good meal or a good workout, or if we, get a raise or finish a class or whatever it is. Like, it's our brain rewarding us for something that we have enjoyed. And so this is the chemical that tends to get overproduced with certain drugs. So like cocaine or marijuana or alcohol, nicotine, whatever, it produces this overabundance of dopamine. And that is why, or not the whole reason why, but part of the reason why people get addicted is because of this brain chemical. So funny enough, sex is one of the strongest generators of the dopamine reward. So you could almost say that sex could be more addictive than hard drugs. And that's beneficial in a marriage. It works out really well for two spouses to kind of have that going on to where they're getting addicted to each other. It's not so hot outside of marriage. That's where it can cause a ton of problems. The other chemical, especially for women, not so much for men, they have a different chemical, but for women, the other big chemical that plays a huge part in sex is oxytocin, and that is a bonding chemical. And it is primarily active in women. Men have more vasopressin, I believe, and I'm not going to get into that because this podcast is for ladies. So I'm going to talk about what affects us ladies. But again, it's a bonding chemical, and women use oxytocin in 4 different ways. So the first way we use it is like through meaningful and intimate touch. So this doesn't have to be sexual. This is hugging, holding hands, cuddling. And what it does is that it helps us to bond with people, and it strengthens the trust factor that we have with someone. So that's why, like, you and your best friends, or even, when you've got your kids, mother and child or whatever, that good touch, that comforting touch, that, just being able to comfort somebody and encourage somebody with physical touch, it strengthens a lot of things, primarily your bond to them and how much you trust people. It also obviously shows up in sexual contact. And so it helps us feel more strength of trust and infatuation towards people, or the man that we're having sex with. And of course, there's higher levels of oxytocin released during orgasms, which is why if you're having really good sex with somebody, you feel super close to them. You feel really bonded to them. You feel like your relationship's really strong. You feel like things are going really well, even if it's not, because it's the good sex and all the orgasms that's giving you this extra rush of this chemical oxytocin that's bonding you to them. Women also release oxytocin when they have labor. So when they're having a baby, because it helps your uterus to contract and bring the baby down. And then very last, it happens with nipple stimulation after you have a baby. And what it really does is that it helps you produce breast milk, which is great so that you can feed your baby. And so it's actually a really interesting cycle in that area of child rearing, because like when you put your baby to your breast and you're nursing your baby, you're producing oxytocin that helps you to bond to your child. And because the baby's getting so much skin to skin contact and they're drinking from you and they can smell you and they can hold you and they're being cuddled by you, that's what helps babies bond to mommy. So that's, if you can see how wise and how awesome our God is, that he's designed these chemicals for a very specific reason. And you can see why in the right context, they're amazing. Because the bond that oxytocin creates, it's not just emotional. It's actually physically changing your brain and almost rewiring it to crave that person and the touch and the feelings that you associate with them. And here's the crazy thing, ladies. Here is the crazy thing. It only takes about 20 seconds of hugging to release enough oxytocin in women to start triggering your brain's trust circuits. And that's not me making that up. That's actually from a study done by the University of California. And I bring that up to say, as you're getting to know a guy and you guys start going out and you start, hanging out or whatever, be very careful and very cognizant about even just cuddling them. And not because it's wrong and it's bad and you shouldn't hug men that you're not going to marry. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that unless you know this person is trustworthy, unless you know that this might be going somewhere, you are going to start bonding with that person if you're spending a lot of time snuggled up to them and cuddling them and smelling their cologne and hearing their voice and all this other stuff. You want to make sure that there's an actual foundation there so that your mind does not start playing tricks on you about what this relationship actually is and where it might be going. Because again, it only takes 20 seconds of hugging for that stuff to start kicking in and for you to start bonding to that man and start, creating those receptors that makes you think that you can trust him. You want to make sure that's true before you get there. So if all that wasn't enough, there's also neurological pathways. And I'm not going to get super scientific because I'm not a super scientific person, but I thought this was fascinating and it really helped me to see things clearly. So it takes about 6 weeks of steady stimulus to create like a new neurological pathway in your brain. And your brain loves these pathways because once they're there, it's actually less work for your brain to do, because now it's got this kind of established pathway that it can just go down and it's less work. So it's less work like making decisions, because your brain has a lot to do. It's got to basically keep you alive. It's got to do all these things, like from your breathing to pumping, being regulating all of your bodily systems. So whenever there's an easy shortcut for it to take, it's going to take so that it frees up space for it to do other important things. And that's why habits are so powerful, because once they're set, your brain's going to default to them. And I say all that to say this. Even when you feel like you're just in a short-term relationship, especially if you're having sex, it can cause so much heartache when it ends because you've bonded to that person. And not only have you bonded to them, if you've been together and you've been doing this for at least 6 weeks, your brain has created like a little neurological pathway involving that person that's going to default to that when you guys are together. Because that bond is like sticky tape. Or, it's not even like sticky tape. It's like wax. For those of us who've been waxing, you know what I'm talking about. They put that wax on there. It's all good. It bonds and everything is fine until you rip the wax away. And then you talk about pain. Girl, pain. That is the same way that happens in a relationship. It's like getting your heart waxed. That's how it feels. It's painful. It's burning. It's awful. And that's because like you're going cold turkey. And it's almost like you have an addiction to that person. So it's just like somebody who's having to quit smoking cigarettes or give up sugar. Your brain is used to them now. There's a neurological pathway for that relationship. And so then when it ends, it's almost like the emotional part of your brain is fighting with the rational part of your brain, because the emotional part says, well, that's where we get all of the dopamine and the oxytocin that we want to have. We get it from that person. We get it from the sex that we have. We get it from this relationship. So we need to go back and get it because I need to have it. And this is how we get it. This is the pathway that we've created. What are you doing? Why are you fighting me on this? And the rational part of your brain is the one that's saying the relationship is no good. He's not good to me. He's cheated on me. We shouldn't be together. He's not a Christian. It's not going anywhere. And like logically, you know that, but your brain does not know that the man that you were sleeping with was not your husband. Your brain is doing what it was designed to do, which is to kind of follow that pathway, keep the connection and the bond that's there, that's been created, because God designed us to have that whole system working with one man, our husband. That's why it's such a cluster when we end up doing that and creating those pathways outside of marriage. And then when you do that enough, when you get into relationships, you have sex, and then you split up, you basically start to train your brain into thinking that that pattern is normal. That's a getting together, having sex, and splitting up is a normal pattern. That's what you're supposed to do. So then what happens when you go from that pattern to a marriage? It causes problems because you haven't trained your brain for long-term relationships. You've been training it for short-term relationships. And if you think that that is not going to impact your marriage, girl, you are wrong. It totally will, because that's how your mind is working now, and you have to retrain it for something long term. And so that can be part of the reason, not the whole reason, but part of the reason why monogamy can be so hard for people who are serial daters or are used to having a bunch of short-term relationships back to back. It's also why being cheated on is so painful. So even if you didn't verbally make any promises with your significant other when you're having sex, you're engaging in a covenant act. Your body and your mind are making promises. They're creating covenant. And that's why God didn't design us with the ability to turn off our hormones and all of the bonding chemicals that are released during sex, because he never intended for us to have sex with a bunch of people. He only intended us to have sex with our spouse. That's why our bodies react the way they do. That's why the chemicals show up when they do and how they do, no matter, who we have sex with, because we're not designed for serial sex. We're not designed for casual sex. We're designed to have sex in one committed relationship. So that's why even if you think you're just having a fling or messing around or friends with benefits or whatever it is, when you're cheated on or when the relationship ends, it's a rending and it's a tearing because you've been bonding yourself to this person and making a covenant with them. And when the covenant ends, it tends to be painful. So that's what happens in our minds when we have sex. That's how it affects our brains. The other way that it affects us is spiritually. So one of the things that I find incredibly fascinating, and it was a real light bulb moment for me to learn about, was something called soul ties. And soul ties are in the Bible. They're not always worded as soul ties, but I'm going to give you guys some examples so that you can see what I'm talking about. And a soul tie is just basically, it's two spirits that are supernaturally connected or knit together. So they can be very positive and helpful things like you would find in a healthy marriage or in like a really close friendship. Or they can be very negative things like you would see in an abusive relationship, because they can really open you up to being manipulated or controlled by another person. And the other thing that's like crazy, but I'm so glad I understand it now, is that soul ties can also be a demonic superhighway. Meaning, if you have a soul tie with somebody, any demons or spiritual darkness that they're dealing with and that they're battling with is also going to have a legal right to show up in your life because you guys are tied together. Your souls are one. So anything that they're dealing with, you will now be dealing with. And I hope that that's a light bulb from some of you who have been in abusive relationships or have been with people struggling with stuff. And you can start to see like, man, I was with this person or close to this person and the stuff that was going on, like their drama became my drama. Their issues became my issues. Part of that is a very good chance that you guys had a soul tie. And that's why that stuff that was happening in their lives started showing up in your life. So how are soul ties formed? Well, The main way they're formed is from sexual relations. So godly soul ties are formed when a couple marries. That's why it says in Ephesians 5:31, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined unto his wife, and the two shall be one flesh." That's how God intended it. So when you're married, you're not just one flesh in your body. God has actually knit your souls together. It becomes a bond that you have. But when you're having sex with somebody who is not your spouse and it's outside of marriage, that's how ungodly soul ties are formed. That's why it says in 1 Corinthians 6:16, "Do you not know that the person who's joined to a harlot is in one body?" Right? So the two become one flesh. So that bond that you have is not just from the oxytocin and from the dopamine. The bond is also spiritual, which is part of the reason why we talked about the pain of when that ends. Part of it is because you've knit your souls together. You've become one flesh with somebody who's not your husband, and that relationship ends, and you're cutting that. It just causes a lot of pain and heartache, and that's where a lot of it will stem from. It's from the soul tie. Soul ties can also come from close relationships. So King David, when he was younger, and his best friend Jonathan, they actually had a soul tie because of the strength and the depth of their friendship. And it says in 1 Samuel 18:1, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." So you can have a soul tie with somebody you're very close to. If you've got a really good friend, somebody that you just love, you guys can actually knit your souls together because of the depth and the strength of your relationship. And it doesn't say specifically, but just go reading the text, I would say there's a good possibility that maybe Ruth and Naomi also had a soul tie because of just the strength of the love that they felt for each other. There's a chance that their souls were knit together as well. Don't quote me on that. I don't know if it's 100% sure or not, but just, again, reading it and looking at their relationship, there's a chance that that was the case. Another way that soul ties get created is through vows and oaths and agreements. You have to be so very careful when it comes to making vows to people. I know it was like common practice in the 80s, like if you watched any coming of age movie with boys in the 80s, like people would make blood pacts, like they would like blood brothers, and you cut your hand and like you shake hands and you mix blood, like people, and thinking that, oh, it's just like a promise, but it's not. If you just made a blood oath, a blood covenant, even like you think that you can break that, but like that stuff is enforced supernaturally. It's enforced in heaven. And we are at this point in our society where people break promises all the time. Like people don't think anything of promising and making a vow and say they're going to do something and then not doing it. And that's nothing to most people, not realizing, especially as Christians, that like the stuff we say is being recorded in heaven. The stuff that the promises that we made, they're enforceable on the supernatural side of things. And you have to be so very careful with your words, because what you don't want to do is get yourself in a position where you're an oath breaker, where you haven't honored a vow. That's a topic for another episode because I don't have time to get into it, but soul ties can be created by the words we speak and the vows that we make. That's why Jesus is very clear in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, "You shall not swear falsely," or I'm sorry, "Again, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But this is Jesus speaking, but I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by the earth, for it's his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, let your no be no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one." Be very careful with swearing and making vows and promises that you do not intend to keep. So the bottom line in all of this is that a sexual soul tie to a man who is not your husband, or even a platonic soul tie with the wrong person, is bad. It is potentially a very dangerous thing, and it's something that most people aren't even aware of. But we have to be aware of it. We have to be careful, because we know the Bible tells us that our enemy, the devil, is prowling around like a lion looking for who he may devour. And a lot of times having these soul ties, and just really kind of messing things up on the supernatural side of things really affects our entire lives. And we may not know that the problems that we're dealing with, the struggles that we're going through, some of the adversity that we're facing, just a lot of that stuff has a spiritual origin, and we keep trying to figure out how to, deal with it on the regular side, not addressing the spiritual part of it. And that's where a lot of it is originating from. So when you take all these things together, the physical pleasure and the physical consequences too of sex, the hormones, the chemicals, the soul ties, you can start to get a really clear picture of why God put sex into the boundary of marriage in the first place. That is 100% for our safety, so that we can enjoy it in the way that he created it, so that when our bodies start to make that bond and starts to make us have all this trust towards that person, it's towards our husband, and they start to have that same towards us, because it's meant to be for a relationship that doesn't end. It's meant to be for a lifelong relationship where it continues to grow and strengthen. So all of that is the third thing I wish that somebody would have told me, is that sex is more than physical. The fourth thing I wish I would have known is that friends with benefits is stupid, and it's also a lie. Because the truth is, when you have a friends with benefits relationship, you're using each other. You're using each other for what you feel like is risk-free sex or whatever you want to call it. But real friends don't use each other. Real friends don't take advantage of each other. That's not how it goes. So when you have that relationship, you're not really friends. And if you are really friends, if you actually have a genuine relationship where you really care about the other person and you want what's best for the other person, then there's no way to just have sex and have it stay platonic, because somebody, and probably both parties, either going to feel guilty about the fact that they don't feel more, which is usually more on the guy's end, or they're going to start developing much deeper feelings, because now you've already got a foundation of friendship and trust and love, and now you're adding sex to it. It's going to blow up in your face. That's just how they go. And I'm telling you this from experience, and not to say that, I'm not, obviously you guys know I'm not bragging. I'm just saying I've been there. It doesn't work, because it's not designed to work. And one of the last things that I wish I would have known about sex is this: being casual about sex will make you feel used, even if you feel like it's on your terms. So like I told you guys, I went through that year where I was like, obviously I'm not going to marry this guy. What's the point of waiting for sex, because to get married for sex, because I didn't know all of that stuff we just talked about with soul ties and hormones and all of that. And I tried it. I thought, well, this is what people do. Everybody else I know is having casual sex and one night stands and friends with benefits and this and that. What's the point of me like missing out on all this great action and fun? And it just made me feel really used, because my heart's not designed for that, and your hearts aren't designed for it either. But I wanted love, and I wanted something more than just the physical portion of it. And I wasn't getting that. And it didn't even matter if it was my idea or if it's something that I was, trying to go out and find. Like, at the end of the day, I couldn't help but feel a little used, like it was just transactional. And it wasn't what I wanted. I thought that if I had it, I would get over it, and I would become this like worldly wise woman who could like joke about sex and try to go out and get mine. And however, I was trying to basically I was, trying to turn my brain into an issue of Cosmopolitan magazine, how the way that they present it. And it turned out to be smoke and mirrors and a big fat lie, because it just left me feeling just empty about it. And that's not what I wanted. And that's why I was like, almost a year to the month when I thought, God, this is not for me. This is not for me at all, because I don't like how this is making me feel. I don't like what it's turning me into. And I don't want this. I want something more. So I'm going to wait until you bring my husband to me, Lord. And I don't want anything to do with it. And if you guys have been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you know how that worked out for me. When I finally did meet my husband, I still made some mistakes along the way, but I'm very grateful that I made more of an effort with him to keep sex out of the relationship, because I had learned a couple of lessons. And that's my hope and encouragement for you guys as well. So All that to say, how is it possible as a Christian woman in the 21st century, how is it possible to have sexual integrity when our society and even a lot of people in the church just disregard it and feel like it's outdated and old-fashioned? So the first thing you can do is what you've already done by listening to this podcast is really to understand God's plan for sex and how it affects you so that you can make wise decisions. Because if I would have known everything that I just told you guys, about the soul ties and about the heartbreak and bonding to people, like there is a plenty of people that I would have never have touched with a 10-foot pole, no matter how attractive I thought they were, no matter what they said, because I would have known, like, I am not trying to get I'm not trying to tie my soul to yours. I'm not trying to get attached to you, knowing that it's going to happen anyway because of the way that my body is set up. I would have made better choices. So the first thing you can do is just educate yourself, read about it. I will eventually write a book about it, but I don't have one right now. But you can actually look into, there's a great book called The Invisible Bond, and that's by Barbara Wilson. It's an amazing book, and I highly encourage you guys to go out and get a copy of it and read it. And she really goes into more depth into a lot of the stuff that we just talked about today. So that's the first thing, understanding God's plan for sex and how it affects you. The second thing is learn to be very careful with intimacy. And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about like holding hands and kissing and cuddling. Because like I said, 20 seconds is all it takes for that bonding process and for your brain to start thinking that they can trust somebody. Just be very careful with that. Be very, very aware of that as you enter into relationships with men that you feel like you would like to see where it would go. That's all part of guarding your heart and making sure that you don't start something, based on a foundation that's not actually there. Make sure that you can trust him by spending time with him, listening to what he says, seeing if what he says and what he does matches up, seeing how he reacts under pressure, seeing how he acts and reacts with other women around him, especially like family members, how he treats them, how he talks about them, and like really get a good idea before you take your relationship from just friends to any kind of physical contact, because you don't want to make things harder on yourself than it has to be if it turns out that it doesn't work out with that guy. The other thing that you can do, and I think we'll actually have an entire episode just on this, and you guys have heard me say it before, but it's so important, set your boundaries and enforce them. And that kind of goes along with what I just said about like the physical boundaries. Make sure you know what yours are so that you can enforce them, and don't be shy about saying that, because here's the thing. When you have boundaries and you enforce your boundaries, people will respect you more, because they know that you're not the kind of person that gets stepped on and walked on. They know that you're the kind of person who has enough confidence in themselves that says, this is what I do. This is what I don't do. If you like it, great, let's move on. If you don't, you can go. Either way is fine with me. And that's going to be something that is not just important like in, dating relationships. It's kind of important in life in general, but it's definitely something that I feel like a lot of women will compromise our boundaries because we start catching feelings for guys and we really like them. And I'm speaking from experience, and that's what happened to me. I wish that I would have set and enforced more boundaries with my husband before we got married, but I didn't. So I'm not talking down about you. I'm also talking to Audra from, 18 years ago when I first met him. But make sure that you know your boundaries, you set them and you enforce them. That's another way that you're going to make sure that you are having sexual integrity. Number 4, stay accountable. It is so hard to do this on your own because, again, the desire and drive for sex, especially when you have a connection with somebody and you feel like you might be in love and you care about them, all that is natural. Nothing is wrong with any of that. But it just makes enforcing your boundaries so much harder once you start falling in love with that person and you know you can trust them and you know that they would make a great husband. For me, it was finding out that my husband, I knew he would make a great father. Like that was like the straw that broke the camel's back because I knew what a great man he would be. So I wish that I would have had accountability partners that I could come to, that I could say, man, I'm really struggling. I really like this guy. It's getting really tough to like enforce my boundaries. Can you please encourage me? Can you please pray with me? Can you please maybe come out with us? Can you help me figure out ways to make sure that we're not spending this alone time together so that you can enforce your boundaries? So definitely stay accountable. And that's whether that's a friend or a parent or a pastor, or that's something that I actually do for my clients when I coach them. I'm part of their accountability system because they know they're going to talk to me every week. They know that they can, reach out and say, Audra, I'm struggling. Do you have 15 minutes to pray with me? They know that they're going to get that from me. And the very last thing that you want to do is make sure that you cover yourself spiritually, because temptation is the devil's stock and trade. He will tempt the ever-loving daylights out of you, and he knows how to do it the best times. When you're weak, when you're tired, when you are just kind of at your lowest, he will throw a temptation in your face that you were not expecting because he's just been waiting for the opportune moment. And that coincidentally is how my husband ended up moving in with me. If he just would have said, hey, I think we should move in together, I'd have been like, no, I don't live with people I'm not married to. But that's not what happened. What happened was his roommate situation that he had didn't pan out, and he needed a place to stay for 3 weeks. So instead of saying, no, you have other friends, you have a sister, you have all these other places you could stay, I was like, okay, sure. Yeah, you could stay here for 3 weeks. It'll be okay. And that's how he ended up moving in with me. And it went from 3 weeks and he was going to be out to us living together for a year and a half. And we had to make the decision, are we going to get married or what are we doing? Because we're living together and this is not what I wanted. But see, the devil knew that. He knew that I wouldn't have gone the other way. He knew that I wouldn't have said, oh, let's move in together. But it happened this way. And because I wasn't aware of it, I didn't see it for what it was. I let it happen and it caused a lot of drama in my personal prayer life because I knew I was sleeping with him and living with him and we weren't married. So there was this huge gap between God and I because I knew I was living wrong and I felt like I couldn't come to him. And it created a huge gap with my parents because once they found out that I was living with some guy, it was a pretty big problem. So that's why I say cover yourself spiritually. Ask for that prayer. Ask God, like, Lord, please give me eyes to see. Let me know if there's a temptation. Let me know if I've got a weak spot, God. And when temptation comes, Lord, like the Bible always tells us that when we're faced with temptation, that God will not let us be tempted above a level that we're able to bear. And with every temptation, he will always make a way out so that we can endure it. So ask for him to open your eyes so that when you are tempted, because you will be, that you can see the exit ramp of that temptation before you have gone so far that you've kind of ended up in a problem. Okay, so that's it. Again, I know this episode ran a little long. I apologize for running so long, but I really do hope that you guys got a lot out of it. I hope that it enlightened you in a lot of ways. I hope that you had some light bulb moments. If you did, please let me know. I would love to hear your comments. I would love for you to send me an email to let me know at Coats-Hudson.com. You can also find me on Facebook at Audra Coats-Hudson. I'm the only one on Facebook, so if you go on Facebook and you search my name, you'll find me. It's just me. I'm the only one there. But I would love to hear your comments on this. I love getting you guys' feedback. So go ahead and feel free to leave me a comment. And if you remember anything from today, please remember this. Sex and desire are like a fire, and they will burn you if you do not follow God's plan for them. Learn what it is, understand what it is, and ask him for help to make sure that you can adhere to it because it's for your benefit and for your safety. And also this, if you haven't been living by God's plan for this, if you were like me and you had all kinds of sex before you got married, if you're not married, or if you're in a place in your life now where that's how you're living, I just want to encourage you that it was not a surprise to God. I don't want you to feel ashamed. I don't want you to feel embarrassed. I don't want you to feel like you're dirty or anything. I want you to know that there is so much grace and so much forgiveness and so much love for you that space you feel like might be between you and God is closable. And all you have to do is just let him know, like, God, I know I'm wrong. And that's what I had to say, that I know that I'm wrong, Lord. And I just ask you to forgive me, Lord God, to help me on this journey, because I cannot do this on my own. I need your strength. I need your grace. I need your help, Lord, because it's tough, God. I'm in a snare, and he knows that, and he understands that, and he still loves you for it. And he doesn't want this space between the two of you. He wants to close that space and to give you the strength to use sex and put it in the correct boundaries that he's created it for. So I just encourage you now, if you're struggling with that, to just bring it to him, lay it at his feet, ask him ask him for forgiveness, and ask him for help to start aligning your life with his word. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you again so much for joining me. I love being able to put this show together. I hope you really got a lot out of it. And I hope that you will join me next Wednesday and bring a friend. Until next time, this is Audra reminding you to travel light.